Welcome to Ideas in Action, a television series about ideas and their consequences. I'm Jim Glassman. This week, the surge in Afghanistan. Will the buildup of U.S. forces in Afghanistan lead to the same success that it did in Iraq? The Taliban has been fighting an insurgency against the government of Afghanistan, led by Hamid Karzai, for the past 9 years. Now, President Obama is pursuing a military surge, sending thousands more troops to oust the Taliban. He's basing his strategy on the same one used during the Bush administration to break the resistance in Iraq. But not everyone agrees the U.S. was successful in Iraq or that it can be in Afghanistan. Joining me to discuss this topic are Thomas Donnelly, Director of the Center for Defense Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He worked with a group of military experts to develop the strategy for a military surge in Iraq. Matthew Ho served as a Marine captain in Iraq. In 2009, he went to Afghanistan as a civilian political officer. He resigned later that year, protesting continued U.S. involvement in what he termed a 35-year-old civil war. Andrew Exum, a fellow with the Center for a New American Security. He served as an Army captain in Afghanistan. He's helped assess the current strategy there as a civilian advisor to General Stanley McChrystal, the U.S. commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan. The topic this week, the surge in Afghanistan. Can the U.S. use the same playbook it used in Iraq?
Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com.
In 2001, the U.S. led Operation Enduring Freedom, liberating the Afghan people from the tyranny of the Taliban. A new democratically elected government led by Hamid Karzai began trying to rebuild a society and infrastructure left in ruins by decades of war. But the rugged Afghan terrain and porous Pakistani border allowed the Taliban to take refuge and regroup for an insurgency that lasts to this day. Taking the lead from the success in Iraq, in 2008, President Bush began an increase of U.S. troops in Afghanistan that became the foundation for the Obama administration's surge strategy. With plans to ultimately raise the level of U.S. troops to a total of 100,000, the U.S. is still confronting a country filled with fractious tribal leaders and a government overshadowed by corruption. The question this week, is the U.S. surge bringing Afghanistan any closer to a stable democracy? Tom Donnelly, you helped devise the strategy that President Bush used for a surge in Iraq. Why do you think the same kind of surge will work in Afghanistan?
Well, just to correct the record slightly, my role was much more political, and the credit for making the surge work goes to Generals Petraeus and Odierno and the men and women who actually made it so. But with that small self-saving caveat, it is the best idea that we've got. It is a plan that, in broad outline, is applicable. The wars are obviously quite different. The circumstances are different. Our interests are different. But if we are going to be successful in Afghanistan, and I think we need to be successful in Afghanistan, it's the best idea we have, and that there's at least an opportunity, a possibility that this will work.
Andrew, you worked with General McChrystal. How do you think the surge is working now?
I think that the military operations in Helmand province and Kandahar province have gone quite well. I don't think there is any real debate about whether or not we succeeded tactically in Iraq during the surge. The debate seems to be whether or not we were able to succeed strategically and creating a political outcome. And I think we've had similar success in Afghanistan. I think we've also been able to make large strides in building up Afghan capacity. The problem is that with respect to the Afghan government, we do not have a coherent political strategy. And the trick is, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, whenever you wage counterinsurgency on behalf of a host nation, your success depends in large part upon what that host nation government does or fails to do.
Matthew, you felt so strongly that what we were doing in Afghanistan was wrong and that it wouldn't work, that you quit, that you left the State Department. How do you think things are working out now?
I don't think they're any better than they were. The idea of taking the surge or the operations we did in Iraq and implementing them in Afghanistan, there's too many differences. The terrain, the geography, the population, the nature of the enemy, the modern history of the countries, the forms of government that have existed there, that's too different. And so a strategy that says that we are going to put troops into an area where foreign occupation has always been fiercely resisted, and that we are going to then help build up institutions to deliver services to people that don't exist and have never existed, and that this will then cause those local residents of these rural villages and valleys to then align themselves or embrace a government composed of outsiders as well as foreign occupiers at the expense of the Taliban, who are ethnically and culturally similar to them. It's just not going to work in those rural parts of eastern and southern Afghanistan.
Isn't a United States-backed Karzai government more palatable than the Taliban?
No. And the Taliban are not palatable either. But the problem is, if you have to decide, if you're a rural Pashtun in the southern and eastern parts of the country, and you have to decide between the Karzai government backed by American and Western soldiers or the Taliban, you're going to choose the Taliban. And that's why some of us have been saying our presence there fuels support for the Taliban. What that does is that if you pull our forces out, if we're not there, the support for the Taliban dwindles, and we're starting to see that in eastern Afghanistan.
Let me just challenge your premise. Why do you feel that people will not back a United States-backed Karzai government versus the Taliban, which is really a bloodthirsty outfit that murders women in stadiums and that doesn't allow women to go to school? I mean, we all know the problems with the Taliban.
Basically, the crux of it is that those people fought on the side of the Taliban against the Karzai government and those that compose the Karzai government for the better part of 35 years. This is a war that's been going on since 1975, more or less. And so what we've done is we're backing one side of the civil war. So what we need to do, and this is a failure of the bomb process after September 11th, was that we didn't include the rural Pashtuns into the government to the extent it should have been. And that's the problem, is that, yes, about 70% of Afghanistan wants the American support, is in favor of the Karzai government, but there's another 30% that's outside of that government and that's violently opposed to occupation. We need to bring that 30% back into the government. Otherwise, they're always going to oppose it, and they'll continue to take up rifles against it.
Tom, what about that?
Look, I would say Matthew's reading is correct as far as it goes, but a selective one. First of all, there are no, not foreign-backed forces in Afghanistan. Everybody is aligned with some outside actor. And the ultimate question is, of course, who's going to win the war? Who's going to have the strongest military coalition, and who's going to have the most durable political coalition? There's no opportunity for a exclusive Pashtun government to govern Afghanistan and keep it together. Conversely, there's no prospect for a government that doesn't include a large aspect of Pashtun participation. So it's got to be a coalition among all the peoples of Afghanistan. And Karzai is by far the closest analog to that, or the most representative and the broadest coalition. That's why there wasn't an effective challenge to him in the election, and that's why, despite the fact that the Obama administration has been holding its nose very publicly about him, he remains the least bad alternative. And what will happen if we withdraw is not that there'll be a renewed civil war just amongst Afghans, but there will be other outside actors backing local militias who will then squabble over the carcass of Afghanistan, with probably the same result that we saw the last time around, wherein the Pakistani-backed Taliban becomes, at least in the South, the most dominant force. And once again, it becomes a playground for al-Qaeda and other extremist groups.
And why should the U.S. care?
We've got two basic interests in Afghanistan, and not just Afghanistan, but the greater region. Afghanistan is in many ways the least important of the two interests. We have an interest that Afghanistan is not used as a safe haven for transnational terror groups to attack the United States. And right now, we're securing that interest right now.
A lot of people, by the way, say that that's our only interest, and we seem to have secured that interest, as you say.
Not in an enduring way. Unless you want to garrison Afghanistan in perpetuity, then we haven't secured that interest.
Matthew, this question that I asked about, why are we there anyway? I mean, if we did abandon Afghanistan, certainly you would admit that the chances that, for example, it could be used as a base against us rise.
Well, here's the problem: is that I don't think you're seeing people advocating for abandoning Afghanistan. What I'm saying is a continued military effort there is only going to increase instability. As we push more troops into these valleys and villages of southern Afghanistan, we're encountering resistance. We're encountering people who are going to fight us because we're occupying them. So the thing we have to do is find a political situation, a political solution to bring about stability in that country. And then once you have political stability, then you can actually talk about security, then you can talk about development, then you can talk about having a stable Afghanistan that's not a problem for its neighbors. Because I agree, we have to have a stable Afghanistan because it's a very important part of the world. But we're not going to do it on the backs of 100,000 American troops. We're going to do it through political negotiations and getting a political settlement.
But you were in there as a civilian doing political work, I assume. And so why did you just throw up your hands and say, gee, I don't want to do this anymore?
I did not want to continue an effort that was failing or continue an effort that was flawed where our leaders were not acknowledging the reality of the situation on the ground, playing to a political narrative.
Let me ask everyone about, when you talk about a political solution or as a political problem, which I think all of us would agree with, what does that mean about Taliban participation in the government or in some kind of governmental authority, either regionally or throughout the entire country?
Afghans have traditionally self-governed themselves. They've traditionally governed at the lowest level possible. When the king ruled Afghanistan, it was a fairly stable period of time because he reigned by not reigning, and the different regions ruled themselves.
And what period was that?
This was from 1923 through 1933 through 1973, and it was a fairly stable period. But so what you have to do is right now. So in Marja, we had this offensive, which was tactically a success. We brought in a man who'd been living in Germany, an ex-con, nonetheless, for 15 years to rule Marja. The Afghan army and Afghan police forces are not from that area. These are outsiders. They're not welcome there. That's what I mean by political solution. We've got to bring these people who are outside the government back into the government in order to bring about stability. Because without that, you won't have anything.
Should the Taliban have a role in some kind of a reconciliation government?
I actually think we should stop using the term Taliban because it's such a catch-all phrase. Sure, there are people who we would refer to the Taliban or other Afghans would refer to as
means
Taliban.
Teacher, right?
It means student, actually.
Oh, student, sorry.
But, I mean, the Taliban leadership, the Quetta Shura, so-called, Mullah Omar, who was the head of the, or not really the head of state, but the inspirational leader of the Taliban government back in the bad old days, who's still around, there's no place for him or guys like that. They are committed Islamists. And those are the guys who are really loathed by Afghans and basically anybody who's ever had anything to do with them. So there's no role for those guys. But there are a lot of local strongmen, local tribal and clan leaders who are sometimes referred to as Taliban or sometimes called Taliban. And we should try to reconcile with them, peel them off, find a place for them to work constructively inside.
And again, we kind of did this in Iraq.
Yeah, we've been doing it actually, not all that well, but people have tried this in Afghanistan all through the intervening years. Really, what makes people hop back and forth across this fence in Afghanistan is they don't know how the war's going to come out. So if you can convince the marginal Taliban that their long-term security future, because that's the thing people care about the most, so they've got to be safe. If you can convince them that they've got a safe future and Afghanistan that's, as you suggest we're trying to build, yeah, we could peel those guys off, and we would want to, and we're trying to.
So there's Tom is saying we got to win the war, and Matthew is saying that in in injecting more troops, we're causing more trouble. Where do you come down?
Yeah, first off, let me say that, I think we all agree that insurgencies, civil wars end with some sort of political process. The problem is right now is, and I actually disagree with Tom with respect to talking to the senior Taliban. I think that unfortunately those that have the legitimacy to actually push forward with the deal might be some of those that are in the Quetta Shura, some of the old line Taliban leaders, and actually it's that generation that's below them that have actually been much more radicalized since September 11th, 2001. The one thing I'll say is that, as my friend Steve Biddle says, the Taliban is not going to accept a loaf of bread if they think the bakery is going to be unguarded tomorrow. So you have to set the conditions for a political process. You can't, we can all say we'd like a political process. I'd like a political process, but you see in the background, the U.S. Capitol, it can be a difficult thing for it to happen even in a stable, secure democracy. You have to set the conditions, and that's exactly what the United States is trying to do. You have to convince people that their long-term future is held in negotiations, is held with aligning with the U.S. and its coalition allies, with the Karzai regime. You can't just hope that negotiations can lead to an outcome. And one of the things we found in civil wars and insurgencies throughout history is that usually you have to establish some degree of control over the population before collaboration, before reconciliation can take place.
But Matthew is saying that by trying to establish control, that is to say, by having more troops go in, you're actually making the problem worse. You just disagree.
Yeah, I don't know what, I'd be interested to hear what empirical research you're basing this on. I don't think that...
Just my experiences there, both in the east and southern part. And we see it actually. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal on March 26th about how we're pulling our troops out of eastern Afghanistan on the Pakistan border. And stability is occurring there. And that's actually where the second largest insurgent group went to Kabul with a 15-point peace plan. And they're operating in areas where we're actually withdrawing our troops. In the south, where we're pushing more troops in, we're seeing calls to fight us. You're seeing the most violent comments on elections.
Andrew?
And we knew that if you tried to go into places where we had not previously had presence, you're going to have a spike in violence. That's a horrible metric to use for
that happened in
success.
Iraq as well, as I recall, right?
Well, in Iraq was different, though. I was in Anbar province during the surge and participated in those operations there. And it was the U.S. versus al-Qaeda in Anbar province. You could drive a wedge between the population and the insurgency because al-Qaeda was all they offered was murder and intimidation, and they were not from there. They were outsiders. The problem in Afghanistan, and we were saying this, was that how do you drive a wedge between the insurgency and the population when the insurgents are the population, when the population is the insurgency?
Let's talk about another issue that was raised earlier, and that is, what do we do about Karzai? This is a big issue in Washington right now, that he's a partner that is giving the Obama administration heartburn. Is there anything, and he's clearly affecting how the population sees both the United States and the Afghan government. Is there anything we can do?
Well, actually, I think it seems to matter more to Americans than it does to Afghans. It might be a narrowly run thing, but all the, and it seems like a self-inflicted wound. In fact, Afghan expectations about the election were relatively low. This is not a full-throated defense of Karzai by any stretch of the imagination. Whatever tissue of a democratic process there is in Afghanistan, we are tearing by undercutting Karzai. And it's even worse because as we throw him under the bus, he keeps popping back up, but we're not even doing it effectively. And so we've created this situation where Karzai says, well, I might just join the Taliban. You couldn't have a worse sort of metric.
So you're saying we're kind of stuck with him, and he's not that big a problem anyway.
He is what we've got, and we don't have an alternative. Again, the elections kind of, even if you strip away the corruption from the election, it's pretty clear that he's the strongest local actor in Afghanistan. There isn't a locally credible substitute for him, and we look ineffectual as well as indecisive. So it's almost as bad as it could possibly be.
Let me just ask Matthew, and I'll get back to you. Isn't there an issue here with values? I just finished interviewing Afghan women. And to them, what we did 8 years ago was a godsend. I mean, they were now able to go back to school. They're able to get health care, and to reconcile with the Taliban, or to abandon Afghanistan, or even to pull troops out, really leaves them in a tremendously exposed position.
I could tell you that part of that is the rural Pashtun culture. In a city of 30,000 where I was at, where we had over 2,000 coalition troops and Afghan forces, the women were all still covered. The girls didn't go to school. That's part of the Pashtun culture. The problem with that is, and my heart goes out to the Afghan women. I've seen them. I've seen what it's like. But should the United States be waging war to change someone's culture? That's what it comes down to for me on that issue. And what I find is we keep chasing different rationales or reasons for being in Afghanistan. This time last year, we were rushing tens of thousands of American Marines and soldiers into Afghanistan to ensure free and fair elections. I participated in the election process in southern Afghanistan. I can tell you two things. One, the raw Pashtuns boycotted the elections. And two, the Karzai government stole them, absolutely stole them. And that's a slap in the face to every American service member who served there, let alone the families of those who have family members who've been killed there, was these stolen elections.
Right now, we simply have to buy time and space for certain institutions within Afghanistan to be built up to the degree that they're self-sustainable.
Actually, that leads to my next question. I interviewed Ambassador Jawad recently, the Afghan ambassador to the United States, and he told me that success depends on the resilience of international partners in Afghanistan, including, most importantly, the United States. So how long should the United States be in Afghanistan?
A long time. I mean, one place that I would agree with Matthew on is that this is a fight that's not going to be settled in the near term. Our 18-month horizon, or down to 15 months now, is way too short. There's a saying that everybody knows and everybody repeats because it's true, that Americans have or the Westerners have all the watches and the Afghans have all the time. And that sort of captures particularly how the Afghan people look at this, and how the Pakistanis look at this, and how the Indians, and in fact, everybody else takes a long-term view, except for us. So we've been very impatient to our detriment.
So do you believe what President Obama says? We're going to have a surge, but by the way, we're pulling out.
Well, I think when President Obama first talked about that 18-month time horizon, I was among the many who I think were a little bit upset about it, for the reason that he had kind of two audiences he has to address, right? He has to address the American people of other troop-contributing nations, to reassure them that we're not going to be in Afghanistan forever. But he's also got to tell the people of Afghanistan, who have to make a decision in this conflict, as well as the Taliban and their supporters in Pakistan, that, hey, our troop levels may go up and down, our financial commitment may go up and down, but our interests in Afghanistan are enduring. He didn't do that very well, sending that 18-month time period. But there's a third dimension here, and that when we talk about influencing the behavior of the Afghan political class, that 18-month time horizon actually becomes quite useful. So I think that we can use that to a degree to affect the behavior of the Afghan government.
Because the Americans are leaving, and that makes politically
absolutely. Working with Afghan government officials, and when I was there, there was no honest desire to reconcile with the other side, because the United States was propping them up. When you'd ask them how long should the U.S. be here for, the responses back would always be 20 to 30 years. Except, of course, when you talk to an Afghan villager who said, just leave us alone. I don't want any of you here. Leave us alone. But so what I think happened with that withdrawal date, and why it was a good thing, was it forced the Karzai regime to realize that their days of being propped up by American military force may not be that long, and that we now need to reconcile. We need to find a way to settle this. And so I think that's why we've seen very public statements by the Karzai regime since December advocating for reconciliation, with, of course, this peace jerker coming up in May.
But that's when we started complaining about Karzai's behavior. You can almost track these things through time. When Karzai got the message that we were seriously thinking about getting out, and there was always an asterisk with the Obama administration, we'll begin to draw it down maybe in July. So, that's when he started hedging against the fact that the prop to his power wasn't going to be there. So he has to bring back all the thugs that they threw out before to help him steal the election.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up, and I just want to ask a quick question all the way around the table. Just take a guess. How long do you think United States military forces are going to be in Afghanistan?
In a combat role for 5 or 6 years. That's not what I want to see, but I believe we'll be there in a combat role.
You'd like us to leave, or certainly leave within 18 months.
I'd like us to have a withdrawal in line with a negotiated settlement. But I also have been calling for a ceasefire because I don't see the fighting that we're doing accomplishing anything.
Tom?
I would want to not accept the distinction between combat and not combat, and I think at some level we'll be there for decades and decades.
Andrew?
I think that we've got about another 18 months of hard fighting, at which point we'll start transitioning over a course of another 2 years to some sort of foreign internal defense or security force assistance. And I think that's going to continue for another 5 to 10 years. So I'd say 10 to 15 years.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Matthew. And that's it for this edition of Ideas in Action. For more on this episode and other shows, go to www.ideasinactiontv.com. I'm Jim Glassman. Thanks for watching.
For more information, visit us at ideasinactiontv.com. Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com. This program is a production of Grace Creek Media and the George W. Bush Institute, which are solely responsible for its content.